thank you guys for coming. My voice usually doesn't sound like this. I am really, really sick. So, like, don't touch me at all. I will infect all of you with something just awful. But it's nice. I should take advantage of it. It's very rarely that I can sing Johnny Cash. Because you're mine, I walk the line. Yeah, won't be able to do that in 2 weeks. Anyway, so what are we doing here? All right, that's me. As a freshman in college at UC Berkeley, I'm very grateful. Oh, thank you. So there are some bears here at this place that was founded by people from Stanford. That's nice to know. But yeah, so that was me. That was me, like probably before classes even started when I was a freshman in college, where my search engine of choice was, of course, AltaVista. I remember when people first told me about Google, I said, why would I ever use a different search engine? AltaVista is perfect. So, but, you know, it looks like you guys won that battle. It's funny, you should go to altavista.com now. It's not the same thing. Anyway, but I started creating languages when I was a freshman in college. I came to college with the express intention of being an English major in order to teach English at the high school level. And I eventually did finish out that major, but in addition, when I got there, I became fascinated with language, and I was really just blown away by how many languages you could take at Berkeley. So I took Arabic my first semester because I didn't want to just, you know, really go nuts yet. It was my first semester. I wanted to get my feet. But then my second semester, I took the second semester of Arabic. I took the first semester of Russian. I took the first semester of Esperanto, which was a student-run class. That was pretty cool. In addition to, I guess, an English major class. It would have been 19th century literature. And my first linguistics class, which was just a very basic introduction to linguistics, which I took as a favor to my mother. She said I would really, really like linguistics. I didn't think I would because I was always interested in learning languages, not in studying them abstractly. And so my first reaction was, why would you ever do linguistics? You don't even learn the languages. It seems pointless. But first of all, it came along really easily, and it was a lot of fun. It's so much different from, you know, reading novels and writing long essays about them. It was all of that stuff kind of contributed to me creating my very first language in college, which was terrible. It was so terrible, I'm not even going to show you an example of it, but just to give you an idea of its terribleness. The name of the language was Meg Davy. My name is David. My girlfriend at the time was named Megan. You can fill in the rest of the blanks. Anyway, eventually I found other language creators online because, like most language creators, I thought I was the very first person to do it. Or in my case, I thought I was the first person to do it for fun. I'd heard of Esperanto and its competitors. I'd never heard of somebody creating a language for fun, despite having heard of Tolkien, had no idea it created languages. And being a fan of Star Trek: The Next Generation, had no idea Klingon was a language. That's just the way it went for us. But anyway, I went about with it, and I started creating languages, and I eventually kind of got better at it. This is, I think, my biggest and best-known language before I started creating languages for television shows. This is a language called Kamakawi, and you can see this sentence here. Okuke, what was that? Oh boy, my eyes are terrible. Okuke mata yelea oala okuka, which means I never saw the talking rock again. So if you ever wanted to know how to say that, that's how you do it. Anyway, but I kept on with linguistics, of course, and so I really started to learn more and more about languages. These were three of the most influential people in my linguistics career. One on the left there, it was somebody you might be able to recognize. That's John McWhorter, and he's kind of famous. He's been on the Colbert Report, so that means he's famous. He taught a class on pidgin and Creole languages, which just totally blew my mind. And then when I went to graduate school at UC San Diego, the middle fellow is Farrell Ackerman, and he just completely blew my mind again once I realized that you don't have to analyze language in terms of morphemes, for those of you who are linguists in there. You don't. It's a theoretical construct, and it's a bad one. I'm just going to say that. On YouTube, don't do morphemes. It's just a mistake. It'll lead you down the wrong path, and it leads to bad created languages. But anyway, so Farrell, and then the next person I have never met, that's Joan Bybee, but I read her book, The Evolution of Grammar, which was my third, big, huge revelation for language that completely blew my mind. And that kind of took me to where I am today. I wanted to meet her. I was in Albuquerque once. She's at New Mexico. And I sent her an email, said, hey, I'm a language creator. I worked on Game of Thrones. I'm a really, really, really big fan. And I was wondering if I could meet you. And she said, well, I'm not going to be in campus while you're here, but it's nice to know you. And that was it, but that's all right, because she is an absolute genius, so she can do whatever she wants. Anyway, so they really kind of shaped my linguistic understanding, my formal understanding of language. And then some of these folks, these are just some of the people who really influenced me as a language creator. Because, oh, by the way, I was a freshman in 2000, so I guess I've been doing this for like 14 years now, almost 15. But these are some of the language creators I knew who, when I finally got out of my phase of thinking I was the only person who did this and was therefore the best at it, once I started seeing some of the work that some of these people had done, I was like, wow, I am really terrible and I've got a lot to learn. And I learned a whole lot from them. You might know a few of those names, like John Quijada's language was profiled in a story in the New Yorker because his language was taken up by, well, what turned out to be Russian terrorists. It's absolutely true. It's a fascinating story. Sally Caves wrote an episode of Star Trek: The Next Generation. She wrote the episode Hollow Pursuits that introduces the character of Barclay. And she's had a language she's been working on her entire life. Anyway, these are really outstanding people that took me over the hump and helped me realize that I had a lot to learn. And I've done a fair bit. Anyway, so the reason people probably know me is because of my work on Game of Thrones. That's my kitty. She has such a lovely face. She's a nice kitty. Very nice kitty. She meows very loudly. Anyway, so I started working on, Game of Thrones is a show based on these books written by George R.R. Martin. The first language I created for it was Dothraki. I wanted to create High Valyrian, and then a variant of it I call Low Valyrian. And there's a new language coming that I can't say anything about. Anyway, what I thought I would do today is, teach you something about what it's like to create a language. I was insanely proud of this. Look at that chalkboard. It's hilarious. And of course I used Comic Sans. Why wouldn't you? Anyway, but I thought what I would do is, since the book that I did, Living Language Dothraki, just came out, I thought I would go over kind of some steps about creating a language using Dothraki as a model, which is, it's different from when you're sitting down and creating a brand new language just totally on your own, and you'll see why. But it's kind of a way in. So if you were creating your first language, what might you do? Well, the very first thing that a language needs is a purpose. And this is insanely important, and I think that it does not get enough credit. Because you can sit down to create a language for any reason, but you need to know what that reason is. And if you don't, you're undoubtedly going to have a language that tries to fulfill a bunch of different goals. For example, maybe you do some things in the language just because you like it. Then you do other things in the language because you think that's the way languages work, even if you don't like it. And then maybe you do other things because, well, I want it to be easy to learn. Then you do other things just because you think they're neat. And so it ends up being a language that serves a whole bunch of different masters and ends up being a disaster. Kind of like my first language. Yeah, don't Google it. Well, Google it. I wrote an essay about how my first language was so bad and why. So if you Google Meg Davey, you should find it. But anyway, so with Dothraki, I guess, I always ask this question when I'm working for any show, which is basically, are the speakers of this language approximately humanoid? So with the Dothraki, of course, they're supposed to just be humans. But like with other shows I work on, for example, Defiance, they're a bunch of aliens, but they're really, really kind of human-y aliens. Same with some of the other shows I've worked on, like Star-Crossed. Like, they're human in the most important ways. Like, for example, they have to get together in order to produce children, and they have some sort of vested interest in rearing them. They have the same kind of speech organs, things like that. It's like, if those are all true, it's like, yeah, they're basically human. So anyway, if the speakers are basically humanoid, then they deserve a language that is basically human. And the things that kind of make our languages human are not like, for example, you sit down and say, oh, I'm going to throw in a language and it's going to have nothing but clicks in it, or it's going to have 20 different pronouns. Like, nah, that's not the way our languages work. Our languages are basically evolved steadily over time, and they're kind of like the least common denominator. I mean, you can do really interesting things in English if you want, but if nobody else understands you, then it's not, that little facet you've created isn't going to pass on. Kind of like how I pronounce both with an L. I always have. I don't think that's something that's really gonna... Anybody else do that? Yeah. Yay! Right on. There's two of us. Pretty soon you all will be doing it. Or even if you won't, your children will be. We'll get to them. And then we'll spell it B-O-L-T-H the way it should be spelled. Anyway. But so yeah, when you sit down to create a language, if they're human, the language should be human. But of course, I discovered working for a television series, there are other factors that come into play. So for example, when I did my Dothraki proposal, and the way it worked, it was a competitive process. So there were like 30 other language creators that were competing for that job. And so what I ended up doing, because the application was interesting in that it didn't put a cap on the amount of material you could present, which meant that it was a Cold War. I decided I'm going to do two things. One, I'm going to overwhelm the producers with more material than they could possibly sift through, and I did. By the time I gave them my final proposal, had like a month and a half to do this. I had over 300 pages of material. And I thought, I'm going to make it look, as complex and linguistic-y as possible. So they'll just look at it and go, whoa, that's huge and enormous. I can't even comprehend that. Then what I'll do is I'll give them 1 page of material that's called Dothraki Fun Facts. And it'll just have some of these things about the language that are totally, the things that people that don't really know a lot about language want to hear about language. So this was one of those factoids that I put on this 1-page thing. So did you know the Dothraki have 4 different words for carry, 3 different words for push, 3 different words for pull, and at least 8 different words for horse, but no word which means please. It's like, whatever. It's true. It's not necessarily that interesting, but I thought it would be something that they would really latch onto. So at this time I'd seen an early version of the pilot, which was very different. And then what happened later on when I was doing translation and I saw that there was a new version of the pilot, suddenly there was this new scene that was added where Amelia Clark turns to Ian Glenn and says, "What's the Dothraki word for thank you?" And then Jorah turns to her and says, "In Dothraki, there is no word for thank you." As it happened, there was. So this is just a little screenshot of an early version of the dictionary, the English to Dothraki side of the dictionary that I had. And I've highlighted there the Dothraki word for thank you. And then, of course, the next thing I did was just hit the delete button. Because, of course, when you're working for a television show, you have masters above you. You're not exactly the one who calls all the shots in the language. So yeah, now Dothraki absolutely has no word for thank you. That word sanacho, it doesn't exist. It does not exist in the language. It's gone. All right. Next, all right, so once you've got your purpose down and you know exactly why you're creating this language, the next thing you need to do is create the sound system, basically how you say stuff. And so it's like the boring version is this. This is the phonology of Dothraki. And the linguists in the room will see that and know kind of what it is. Phonologies kind of arrange themselves in this way. But that was the end point. So what I had to start to do was, usually it's up to you to decide how you want it to be pronounced. But what I had to do was, there were a whole bunch of words in the books that were already existing. And one of the goals, not only for the producers, but also for myself, because I know how big George R.R. Martin's fan base is, even before Game of Thrones. Now it's, enormous, but before it was big. I wanted to basically take everything that was in the books and make sure that it was still grammatical and worked when I had finished the language. I thought it would have been a really unfortunate thing if, I saw it was in the books and said, yeah, I get what you're trying to do here. Now here's the real Dothraki. No. That's just silly. So I started off kind of like this. Here's some words that are in the books. And depending on how you analyze this, whether you analyze these things as consonant clusters or single consonants or digraphs, I analyze them as digraphs. These actually all have the same structure. They're all consonant, vowel, consonant. So KH is ch, SH is sh, And then what's spelled J, I ended up doing as an affricate j. Seemed to make sense. So they all have that structure. What that means is that if if there are words that have that shape, there are going to be more words that have that shape. So then that was kind of like the place where I first started. So it's like, okay, well, we've got this shape, so let's create some more words that are of that same shape using the same phonology. So those are words that I created that weren't in the books that still have the same CVC shape. And then, of course, there are more words in the books that have a whole bunch of different structures, and so I did the kind of the same process to figure out what the phonotactics would have to be to accommodate everything that was in the books, and then what further I could do with that. I ended up with a structure that kind of looks like this. It doesn't quite work, but I was having problems because if you do parenthesis, C parenthesis, it really wants to turn it into the copyright symbol. But the idea is that you have like your consonant, and then you have a very small number of consonants that can follow it, a vowel, and the vowel is the only thing that's required. You can actually have several vowels in a row. And then a word can end, a syllable can end with a single consonant, or a word can end with two, but a word internal syllable can't end with two consonants. It's pretty simple. It makes sense. Kind of, no, it's not like Turkish at all. Never mind. No, it's not. And then it was up to me to kind of figure out the intonational patterns, which was fun. But anyway, next, though, is you get to the larger part of the grammar. Obviously, this can be an entire book or series of talks. But I'm just going to try to do it quickly. So especially for those non-linguists in the room, grammar exists basically whenever you have two words that come next to one another and there's a meaning. Then there is grammar. So, for example, have this, that's a kitty, all right? It's a word for cat, and this is what a phone looks like. We all recognize that that's a phone, it's a modern phone. So, question is this, what is a cat phone? Feel free to shout out. What would a cat phone be?
Phone shaped like a cat.
There you go, phone shaped like a cat, basically. Or like a phone that was made out of a cat in a really scary taxidermy way. Yeah, so it's like, how do we know that? We know that as English speakers, that's intuitive to us. We have this idea that the first part modifies the second, even though they're both nouns. But notice that I didn't present to you that term in a neutral way. I actually said this, cat phone. I didn't say like cat, phone, I don't know. So there's a difference between, like, for example, listing those two words next to each other, saying, like, I have a cat, I have a phone, and I have a board game. Where you just have this kind of neutral intonation and saying a cat phone. That too is grammar. So in other words, everything that comes into that pairing is something that you have to determine. And it's also why, by the way, in English, like a cat phone is different from a phone cat. What do you think a phone cat would be?
A cat that operates the phone lines.
Yeah, so it's like, yeah, I think so. Like if you're working at a company and you had a cat that answered your phones for you, that would be the phone cat. Yeah, as opposed to the kitchen cat, which makes your meals for you. This sounds like a wonderful place to work. That'd be awesome. And then, of course, there would be the boss cat. Where's the little tie? I need those memos. Also, my wet food. All right. So anyway, with Dothraki, this ends up, if you're a typologist, this is how Dothraki types, basically. So the word order, subject, verb, object. And then you'll notice and then also determiners precede nouns. So if you subscribe to the determiner theory, that determiners are heads and phrases, then you'll notice that heads all line up on the left. So this is a head initial language, a strongly head initial language, and you see verb come before the object. So strongly head initial, but again, this wasn't something that was completely up to me to decide. This is actually, by the way, this concept that, basically whenever two words come next to each other and it means something, that's a really hard concept for a lot of non-language people to grasp. Because when I'm working with writers on various shows, they'll often say, well, I'll just create, some made-up term for whatever this is. And I'm like, no, don't do that. And it's like, look, it's a made-up language. I don't care. And I'm like, no, you just broke the entire grammar of the language. Don't you realize that? And they go, no, I really don't care. So anyway, I mean, other shows. Game of Thrones is actually outstanding. They let me really kind of control it, which is just wonderful. I love them for it. But anyway, so when I was creating the grammar of Dothraki, I actually had constraints. That the big overall constraint that I was going to use George R.R. Martin's text as the primary document, and there are places where words come next to one another and mean something. So this is how I basically determine it. This is a direct quote from the book. you have the crones chanting rach, 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 hajj. They proclaimed, a boy, a strong boy, where that's supposed to be the translation. Obviously, you see there are 3 words that are repeated and 1 word that is new. So then this pretty much, I mean, you could try to do some sort of other funky analysis, but this is the simplest one. This is the most obvious analysis. And so if you have that, then it's like, all right, if that's supposed to be a strong boy, you see the adjective coming after the noun. So like this was, I think, the first example I ever looked at in the books, and I thought, well, that's pretty cool. I mean, you know, George R. Martin always says, oh, I'm not a language guy, I don't do anything, but this is interesting. This is interesting. It's not English. You'd expect the reverse order. And furthermore, also notice what I didn't highlight, the words there. Usually if somebody really doesn't know anything about language, they just do, all right, let's do English and 1 word for every single word here. But no, you see that there's no articles here. That's interesting. That's really, really interesting. So anyway, then the next question becomes, all right, if this is the order that we see for this, how well does it cohere? It actually coheres very, very well. So this is an epithet that the Dothraki use for Viserys, the cart king. And we know that khal is basically the word for king. It's the word for chief. We know that. That was given to us. So then the other word has to be cart. And so we see an interesting noun-noun juxtaposition where obviously one is a modifier, one is the head, and the modifier comes afterwards. So that is incredible. We also have this one, which is another epithet for Viserys, the sore-foot king. And so we see khal there, again, coming first. And so we determine that this is probably the order of these 2 things, you know, if we're following everything. So rhay is probably foot, and har is probably sore. And I did end up determining, by the way, those H's, I thought, well, let's pronounce them. I wanted to make sure that everything that was in the books, I was like, all right, let's treat that like the letter of the law. So that's how Dothraki ended up with H's coming after M's and N's. I really feel sorry for the actors about that. Especially, the worst word is this. So one of the words he created was R-H-A-E-S-H, rhesh, which means land. And so then I decided, well, how would we do the word for world if we needed? I said, well, how about a collective suffix on the word for land, which means like a collection of lands. So the word for world is rhesh. But if you put that into the accusative, which is to make it the object of a verb, it adds an S suffix on the end. And if you think about the phrase, the stallion who mounts the world is, of course, in the accusative there. So it's vish fin sajja, or fin asajja. And then the word for the world in the accusative becomes rhesh, which is just an awful, awful word. I felt so sorry for the actors that had to pronounce that awful, awful word. If I could take that one back, I'd say, no, I'll just create a different word for world. I mean, I thought the etymology was kind of cool, but that is just a mess to pronounce. Anyway, all right, moving on. So this was well, I guess there were 2 full sentences, but this was the longest one. Khalaka dothra imranha. This is the longest one in the book. A prince rides inside me. So if you have khal means king, it's pretty obvious that that's going to be prince. So you see some evidence there of derivation. And we have, you know, Dothraki, and of course they're the riders. So it's like this is probably rides, and that would mean that this would be inside me. And usually the part that gets kind of shunted off is the adposition. So I figured that this was adposition followed by pronoun, and that's how we did that. There's another sentence, the prince is riding. They say the prince is riding khalaka dothrai, so that made this, you know, pretty abundantly clear. Again, you could probably analyze it in a different way, but this seemed like the easiest and most obvious way to do it, and so I thought I should stick with it for the fans. Anyway. So then, of course, you see all these words occur on the book, so it's evidence of a couple of things. First, Dothraki is going to be suffixing, and second, there's going to be things like, you know, verb conjugation. And so I thought it was pretty, you know, uncontroversial to then, you know, have conjugated verbs. I had them agree with the nouns in person and number, and also had these suffixes for derivation. The names turned out to be pretty simple. I mean, there are only 2 female names in the entire book. They're on the right. The others are male names, and you can see the pattern. it's pretty obvious what's going on there. So, that was kind of got for me. So then but then beyond that, once I'd figured everything out, everything else was up to me to do. So like with the pronouns, for example, that's the one that we got. Everything else I was just creating. That pronoun comes from there. Though if I had that to do over, I would have made that pronoun non-nominative. I was going to, but then I forgot. I did that a lot. Anyway, but I think probably the most controversial thing, well, I don't know, it's controversial. The most controversial thing I did with Dothraki was add noun case to the nouns, because I love noun case. And it wasn't going to have articles, which I am a big fan of because I hate articles in any context. I hate creating them. I hate learning languages that have articles. Articles never work the same in one language as they do in the other, no matter how closely they are related. I hate them. Anyway, so these are the old noun cases of Dothraki, as it were. There's just 5 of them. I thought they were pretty easy. And for those, again, non-language people, this is how noun case works. All right, this is English. We say, I saw him. You don't say, me saw he. That's what noun case is. That's all noun case is. You change the form of the noun or pronoun depending on what role it plays in the sentence. And you don't do it for any other reason than that's the way it's just supposed to work. I mean, no English speaker would ever say that, unless, I don't know, they were trying to imitate caveman language, maybe. So in Dothraki, for example, the exact translation of that is anhatihmae, and then the other one is metihanna. So you can see there's the same kind of change going on with the pronouns. But with a greater variety of cases than just basically nominative and non-nominative, you can do other things with it that kind of economize the language. So in English, we have to use a lot of articles and prepositions to do things. So here's the usual nominative, kemis richa, the dried fig is foul. And that second word is the entire verb is foul. So that's what our word looks like when it's just a subject of a sentence. Now here's it doing something else. I ride to the dried fig. I use the same word over and over again so that you'd be able to recognize it. And like I ride away from the dried fig. That's the canonical usage for those 2 cases. So it's like you just add the suffix on there, and that's what that means. And you don't have to have a bunch of other words. It makes it a little more economical. But you can also do other things with these cases, and that's what makes them really fun. So for example, lenta kemison is the stem of the dried fig, and you use that specific case, the away from case, in order to talk about things that are inalienably possessed. So like my hand, plera anhon, it's the hand from me. And then you use the other case to talk about things that you don't possess intuitively. So like this is the dried fig's steed, sajjo kimisi, because he owns a horse that he gets around on. All right. And then you can do other fun things with it. So this is kemis just as a regular object. Anharis kemis. I sliced the dried fig in half. I sliced it in 2. But you also do anharis kemisan. I cut into the dried fig. So maybe you didn't go all the way through. You just gave it a little slice, gave it a sniff, and realized, oh, it's a fig. I'm going to toss this aside. I'm not eating that. Then we have a separate sentence, anhanivak, that means to frown. You can also, or I'm sorry, I frowned. You can use cases along with verbs to create new verbs. So anhanivak gemisan is I disapprove of the dried fig. It's like I frown towards the dried fig. And now that's the word for disapprove. And that's just how it works. Let's see. Another one, let's see, anhalechi gemis. I tasted the dried fig. And now anhalechi gemison, I tried a little bit of it. So you tried from the dried fig. You didn't eat the whole thing. You tried a little bit of it, and again, turned it aside because that's what you're supposed to do with figs. Really not appropriate for eating. Anha nithak, this is a word that just means I'm in pain. So it's like, I guess as a verb, it would be I hurt. I guess would be the best way to do it in English. So anha nithak, I hurt. Because that's a verb there, yeah. But you could also say something like this, anhanitak gemison, and it's really hard to translate this into English. But if you imagine that, for example, like you had a dried fig attached to you right here, and it was just a part of your body, it was just growing out of you, and it had sensation, and you could say, like, just the way you could say, oh, my foot hurts, or my hand hurts, you could also say, oh, my dried fig hurts. That's what this sentence means. My dried fig hurts. The dried fig that is literally growing out of me hurts, and it's such a bummer that I'm a person that has a dried fig growing out of me. Anyway, but anyway, and then this is, I don't know, I thought you just might want to be able to know how to say this. Yerjena even kimis. You're as beautiful as a dried fig. I just thought this would be something useful for you, because I mean, look at those. Just, yeah, there they are. I Alta Vista'd that on Google. All right, so next, the next bit, so it's like, yeah, grammar is bigger than that. I could have a whole talk, but we're just going to stop there and move on to the lexicon. So the lexicon is your entire vast array of words that exist in your language. And so remember how I talked about, I showed you the little bit of the Dothraki fun facts. So one of the things I said on there is like, yeah, Dothraki has 8 words for horse. I knew that the non-language people would love this because they love hearing that, oh, Eskimos got 100 words for snow, and they just love those things. And so I threw that in there, and then it became a thing, and now it's like everybody say, oh, Dothraki has 1 million words for horse. It's like, it does, but so does English. Look at that. You can probably think of more. It's like, so then the question is, well, what does this say about the culture of we English speakers? We're obviously a very horse-ish people, right? I mean, all just horse-focused. Because, I mean, you could just keep going. It's like, no. It just means that there are some people who speak English that, do things like race horses and breed horses. It's a little different with Dothraki. The horses are definitely more important to their style of life than it is for modern-day English speakers. But really, where the lexicon plays a part is in illustrating kind of where, I'm sorry, this is small examples. This is the word for horse in Dothraki, Hrazef, but it would be no different if this were the word for horse, which is actually big dog. Like, it wouldn't change anything about the Dothraki if suddenly that was their word for horse, was a gigantic dog, which I think would be a good word for a horse. I call dogs little horses because of The Simpsons, and so obviously then horses would be big dogs. All right, but anyway, so what the lexicon does with your culture, what it tells you about is really where the people live, what level of technology they're at, and kind of like, I don't know, what their daily interactions are. So for example, these are all words of Dothraki. There's the word for kale, if you ever wanted that, which you shouldn't. Carrot, turnip, cabbage, ugh, awful. I'm not down with cabbage. The word for radish is new. My little cousin created it. When I was in Colorado just this last week, I said, oh, you know what? There's no word for radish, but obviously there's going to be radishes in this area. And she said, I want to do it. And so she came up with gato. That's the word for radish. It's also the word for cat in Spanish, but that's all right. It's the word for radish in Dothraki. Anyway, but Dothraki has no words for these, And it's really, the obvious reason for that is because, well, they just don't live in an area where these types of fruits avocado is a fruit, exist. Avocado is a fruit. Avocado is a berry. I know this because I looked it up on Wikipedia, and so it must be true. Apparently, avocado is a berry. Fascinating. All right. Anyway, so yeah, Dothraki doesn't have a bunch of words for that, but it's because it's just, it's not really interesting that they don't have a word for pineapple. It just means that they don't have pineapples in the place where they live. If they encountered other people that did have pineapples, they'd probably borrow the word, or maybe come up with some sort of a calque for it, on their own if they decided maybe they could call it a dangerous fruit. It's very spiky. Can you imagine somebody actually trying to just bite into a pineapple? I hope nobody would do that they would know that you have to cut it up, but you never know. You never know. Anyway, so the place where actually the lexicon can reflect the culture is usually in places like idioms or expressions or things where you're just talking about daily life. So, for example, we know from the book that they worship a great horse god, and so I gave him this name, Vejof, which is like the great stallion. Vej is stallion, and of is kind of an augmentative suffix, so Vejof is the word for that great stallion in the sky. And then we also saw that they evidently don't respect a lot of modern technology enough to give them, to borrow the words, I noticed, or at least this was my interpretation. So like for armor, they have this word, shortavakov, which means steel dress. That's basically the word for Westerosi-style armor, which they don't respect. And then, when I came up with expressions, we have this expression, Shirakigori hayeran, the stars are charging for you. It means basically good luck, or go you, or break a leg. It comes from the idea that basically a lot of Dothraki superstition and religion is tied up with cosmology. They believe that when they die, first of all, that their bodies should be burned, and then the idea is that the soul goes up to the sky, and they become the stars, and that they ride in the great stallions, Khalasar, in the sky. And so that's why the bleeding comet is so important to them. And along with this, I came up with this expression, Torga Eschei, which means in secret. And it actually means under a roof. So the idea is, if you want to do something and you want to be above board about it, you do it under the open sky. They say that everything important that's done is done under the open sky. So if you're doing something under a roof, you're kind of doing it on the sly. And so that's kind of like where I think the culture can really influence the lexicon in a place where the language creator can have fun. All right, last is the writing system for a language, and sadly, Dothraki doesn't have a writing system. This is mentioned in the books that the Dothraki don't have a written form of their language, so of course, to fit with the canon, you have to stick with that. But that was really a bummer to me, because I love creating scripts. It's like my #1 favorite thing to do in the entire world. Instead, we just had to come up with a simple romanization so that the actors could, see it and be able to figure out how things were pronounced. But I have gotten to do scripts for some of the other shows I worked on, so I just want to show you a couple of them. So like for the show Defiance on Syfy, I got to do 3 scripts for 3 of the different languages I created. This was the Castathan, which is supposed to be kind of like basically the Roman script of the alien universe. Everybody has to use and learn and know how to read this. It's an abugida, so like the top word, I think these are names. The top word says ki, ri, den, Kiriden, Kriden. Frieden, that's what that says. That must be somebody's names, or Fieriden? No, Frieden. I have no idea what that's supposed to be, but it's definitely somebody's name, because that doesn't look like a Castathan word. It looks like somebody's English name. On the lower right hand, though, I can see Tarazwo. That's what that one says. The one with the big, I love that letter, by the way, which is, it's just Zwo on the end. It looks like an M that then goes on like a really cool roller coaster. And then there's a fountain in the middle. That just says Zwo. And it's funny, I evolved it, so there's a reason it looks like that, but it looks cool now. Anyway, so this is another script I created for the Erathians. It's kind of more curvilinear, I guess. And their language doesn't have as much status in the world as theirs. And then this one, for the Indigenes I created, most of the scripts that I create, I evolve naturally over time. And scripts evolve just the way the languages do, except that it's more dependent on the medium. With these, obviously, no naturalistic script would ever be evolved that would be written like this. But the idea is that these Indigenes have kind of genetically modified themselves to do things better than other beings. And so one of the little ideas was that, well, they probably also modified their hands so they can do precise movements exactly the same way every time. Like the big Indigene on the show is a doctor and does surgery, so she's got implants for that. So I figured they could probably modify themselves to produce these glyphs exactly the same way every single time. And so it was a post hoc creation, not a naturally evolved system. Anyway, and this one, did anybody ever watch the show Star-Crossed on the CW? Oh, well, maybe someday it will come out on DVD or Netflix. But it lasted for 1 season, and I was really grateful I got to do a writing system for it. And I decided to do something that was really just funky and totally hard to read and write. I don't actually even know what these things say. The little dipsy doodles you see that go above and below the characters are to they basically tag those letters as being a part of a word type. So I know that the second one is an adjective, and I don't know what it's an adjective for. Or maybe it's just a name, I think. But basically, it's you need to know what the letters say, how the sound changes work, and then how the little things that go above and beyond tag them as different types of words. It's gloriously difficult. I love it. It's so nonsensical. Anyway, and then for a friend's novel, this was fun. It's friend's novel. She created basically, these guys in the novel create a language themselves. They're English speakers, so they're definitely influenced by English and the Roman alphabet, and they wanted to create a way to create a kind of a cipher. So this is basically a cipher, and I have no idea how it works. It's impossible to read, but I did that for her novel called The Zonix Deceit, which is fun. It looks pretty cool. Anyway, so then, what do you do with it? I found that one of the most interesting things that fans have done with it is get tattoos. And that's just really, really cool to me. I would never get a tattoo in my entire life. But I find it really intriguing that they do. So these are all in Dothraki. I think that one is really neat. It says, was it Sheikh Mashiraki Ani across here, which is, it means my sun and stars. And then across the back of the neck, it says Jalan Athdavrazar, which means moon of my life. I was like, yeah. And the one in the lower left there, those are two sisters. And both of them got the same tattoo that says Jekloikloy, which means blood of my blood. So it's like, yeah, we're related. That's cool. I just thought that was so awesome. And then people have also gotten, these ones are even more awesome. They're tattoos in some of the scripts I did, like for Star-Crossed and Defiance here. And yeah, I can't read that. Okay, no, I know the one on the left says Evan, which was that person's boyfriend. And then the one on the right, that's her name. So the one on the right in the upper right, that says Laura. And what's so cool about this tattoo is she got that tattoo of her name on her arm before the show Defiance even aired. They were just giving teasers of like what the language looked like a little bit, and she says, I really want to see what my name looks like because I want to get a tattoo. I'm like, okay, sure, before the show airs. So it was like, I showed it to her, and sure enough, there it is. I was like, wow, that is awesome. But probably my most favorite tattoo that I've ever seen is somebody, his name is Jean Perron, I think he's French, got a tattoo from one of the languages I just created on my own. So this is that first language I showed you, Kamakawi, and this says Ilya Yahuna, silent scream. I don't know what the significance is, but it's like, that was a language I basically just created for myself. And the writing system, the same thing, and he got it tattooed on him. I swear, if I ever meet him in real life, pretty much my house and wallet are open to him. That's just amazing. Anyway, but so that's kind of like, I don't know, it's kind of like a basic introduction to how you go from nothing to a language. And yeah, if you're interested in a more detailed, by the way, run through, I'm coming out with a book next year called The Art of Language Invention with Penguin Random House. But for now, you can always just learn Dothraki. So thank you guys so much for coming and staying and listening. Thank you guys.
So for the show, how much, and for all the shows you've worked on, how much do you work with the actors, and how readily do they accept instruction, and how much do you have to sort of have back and forth with them? Oh,
it totally depends on the show. It totally depends on the show. So like Game of Thrones, I've never worked with the actors. I've met a lot of them. And they do really good work. But they have separate dialect coaches on set for everybody because they were designing different English accents for Westeros. And so then I just kind of send, well, first of all, they get all of my lines, they get all their lines recorded by me on MP3. So that's really, I think, their number one resource, but then they can go to the dialect coaches if they need pointers on various things. But then for other shows, like with Defiance, I talked with pretty much all the main cast before the show started, and then they kind of got the hang of it and go now with the 100, which I work on the CW. I'm actually talking with 2 actors today. So it really depends on the show and the actors and how comfortable they are with it. I've noticed that in general, most of the main cast of every show I work on, they tend to be really good. The ones where it's like, they usually come into the project and are told you're going to be having a lot of lines in a created language. And I think part of the reason why they're hired is because they think it's cool. Most of the actors that I've talked with on every show that I worked on thought it was really, really neat, which I was so grateful for. Because if they thought it was just a burden, it's like, this is probably not going to turn out well. So I've been fortunate so far. Yeah.
I actually had the same question. I was going to ask you about the actors and how they kind of learn the phonology of languages, but you pretty much answered it. So
yeah, I think if I could add a little more, I will note this. Actors that are British tend to be better. Yeah, I mean, no, I mean, well, they tend to get to it more easily. Though, I mean, there's always outliers. Like Jason Momoa was incredible. What a gift that was. I mean, you know, God, dude is a horse. I love that guy, and he really just totally went all out with the Dothraki, and he sounds wonderful. I wish he didn't have to die. I mean, he's still alive. His character. I wish his character didn't have to die. Jason Momoa is alive and well, but. What I've noticed is that I think a lot of the British-born actors and actresses, and from all over Britain, I think that they've had a lot of experience having to change their accent, either to do a different British accent or to do an American accent for lots of the stuff that they worked on. So they're really used to it, and so when it comes to languages, they just jump right in, and they tend to be pretty good right from the get-go.
How do you come up with swear words or curse words, dirty words, whatever?
Okay, you know, there was actually a really interesting book that came out just a couple years ago about curse words in languages. There are patterns. There are patterns. Like, you know, all languages have a feces word. All languages have one of those, and it tends to be a curse word. But then also things will differ. Like in a lot of, like in French, for example, a lot of swearing is with the devil. We don't tend to do that as much. Like, you know, say like, oh, devil take you. It sounds a little fanciful, but it doesn't actually feel like a swear. So it's usually like, there are usual domains that swear words come from. One of them is body functions. Another is reproduction. And then another is like, you know, usually kind of like religio-metaphorical superstition type things. So like, you know, all my languages, they all have a feces word because it seems like every single language on the planet is always going to have a feces word. But then like with the Dothraki, for example, since they place so much cultural importance on being able to ride and being able to ride well, like I guess if you can't ride, they like literally just abandon you and leave you to die, which seems kind of weird. I don't know. It seems cruel. I wouldn't do it. Look, if you were my Khalasar, I wouldn't leave you behind. I'd find a cart for you. So we already had, you know, them insulting Viserys, calling him the cart king, the swordfoot king. So it seemed like calling somebody a walker would be that type of insult where it's like, kind of means gringo when you're talking about somebody who's non-Dothraki. If you're talking to a Dothraki and you're joking, maybe you get away with it. But if you're serious, you could really insult somebody, you know? So I kind of went there for that. And then otherwise, you know, it's just fun stuff with the Defiance languages, where you have all these different alien races, and then they're coming to Earth. There are actually a lot of insults that go back and forth and change kind of meanings coming from English, and then also coming from the alien languages. And there's also a lot of I don't know if you'd call it species tension or racial tension, but there are a lot of those type of terms that end up getting used. So yeah, kind of depends on the project, I guess.
You started sort of going this direction in the last question, but I wanted to ask, for Dothraki, in what way did things like irregulars and the sort of sound of words get influenced by the lifestyle and sort of character of Dothraki, like angry invectives shouted from horse to horse, or communicating from horse to horse when you're riding, like, can't really be a delicate, difficult to understand language?
I don't know. I mean, they do a lot of sitting, too. And also, if you notice, and I did actually like this about how they portrayed it, they show them in their nomadic lifestyle, they show them moving from place to place. And you'll notice that when they move as a herd, it's very, very slowly. So it's not a quick thing that happens. So I figure a lot of conversation happens. You know, it's not that bad. It shouldn't be too loud. So I don't know how much that influenced. I don't think that type of thing really influences, say, the sound of the language or the grammar a whole lot. I don't think that's something that happens in natural languages, at least. And I was going for natural. As far as irregulars, that could be an entirely different talk. But the way that the process is that for all the languages that I create, I start with a very old language, And then I evolve the sound system, I evolve the words, the word meanings, and I evolve the grammar over a period of between like 1,000 and 2,000 years, depending on what the time frame is. And so things like irregular conjugations, irregular declensions, irregular plurals, if a language has irregular plurals, not all languages do, those always come from basically a combination of sound change and analogical change and things like that. So like for example, you know, mouse, mice in English, that actually came from a totally regular pluralization strategy where the old word for mouse was moose with a long oo, and the regular plural was moosey. And then what happened is that the vowels changed, so moose eventually became mouse in the great vowel shift, and then over on the right hand, moosey became moosey, and then we lost that u vowel and it became meesey. We lost the vowel on the end, and then long e became I. And so then we're left with mouse, mice. That's how irregularities emerge in language. And so that's, as a language creator, it's challenging, but that's what you have to try to emulate, that process. So that's where all the irregulars come from. Cool. It's fun.
Thanks.
One aspect of the language that you mentioned in passing but didn't say much about was the prosody. So, what do you do to come up with that scheme? I mean, that's important for actors delivering it for sure.
Right. Yeah, I actually realized too late I should have done something on that. So first, if a language is going to have stress, that's something that you can just plan out and figure out, the stress system. I haven't been courageous enough to try a tonal system with actors. Because it's like, tonal systems, it's so important to get the tone right, you know, it could be a change in word meaning. I just don't feel confident that it would come across the correct way. So, you know, if I was going to be in a situation where I could be on set every single day and be there for every single line and say, no, that was wrong, maybe, but I think the actors would really get tired of that. So I've only done stress systems. And so stress systems, they come up in a very, you know, the stress systems work in a number of ways, basically. Some of it is based on, you know, sound changes. So like, for example, the reason that French apparently has no stress is because it lopped off everything off the ends of words. And so the only kind of stress that's there is like kind of a light stress at the end of a word. Like with Dothraki, for example, the stress system is fairly simple. If it ends in a consonant, it will always be stressed on the last syllable. If it ends in a vowel, it will most of the time be stressed on the first syllable unless the second to last syllable is heavy, then the stress is there. For example, a nice example is to the Dothraki, Dothrakan, stressed on the last syllable. The proper pronunciation of Dothraki is Dothraki, stressed on the first syllable, but the word for dragon, Javorsa, because there's that heavy internal syllable, so it gets penultimate stress. Then there are a couple of other strange things, like there are certain derivation patterns that move the stress around, but you don't need to worry about those. So that's the stress pattern. Then when it comes to the intonation, that really is just up to me to figure out how I want the intonation of a sentence to go. And I am not happy with any method of transcribing intonation that's ever been devised. In linguistics or out of linguistics, I really don't think that there's a good way to do it. So all I do is just first I record every sentence exactly the way it should be spoken and hope that the actors will mimic. And then I kind of do a thing where I do a phonetic breakdown. I don't do IPA because I discovered actors don't learn that anymore, which is too bad. But I break it down syllable by syllable, and I put syllables that are supposed to kind of have like, you know, more prominence in all caps. And so like for languages like Erathian on Defiance that have a really funky intonational pattern, there are often words where like the entire word has high intonation. And because one of the neat things that Erathian does is like for its subordinate clauses, which usually come first, most of the words actually get kind of a high tone. And then when you have the comma, it goes down to the regular low tone again. But again, this is not something that I don't think it could be written down effectively. I don't think it could be conveyed effectively. So So I really just do that with the caps and the lowercase. I record all the lines, and I just say, well, if it works, it works. If it doesn't, it doesn't. Most of the time, it works. I've noticed that the intonation that I do, they tend to do it a more subtle version, especially with Erathiant, but you can still hear it, and I think that actually makes it a little better. Probably my thing is too exaggerated, but at least it gives them the idea how it should sound. Yeah.
On that note, join me in thanking him.
Thanks.